Hello, I'm Morgan Delaney, your author for Dark, Strange, and Fantastic Fiction, and I'm here to read you a special sneak advance excerpt from my latest book, Whispers Behind the Mirror. Now, don't worry, this is the uncut author's edition with all those extra good bits that the editor just doesn't get. The final version will, of course, be a lot smaller by the time it hits the shops. Speaking of which, there is a small spoiler for the previous book, The Forgotten Creatures. So you might want to nip out, grab yourself a few copies, read that, and then come back. This is the fourth standalone book in the Allumiere Sisters Adventure series. And without much more ado, let's now see what's happening in Hawkinge by Hythe. Whispers Behind the Mirror, Chapter 2, All on Her Own. The thing about having a dead man in your sitting room, thought Mrs. Sniffacre, is that the neighbours talk. Still, corpse or not, he was her husband, ex-husband, so what should she do? Tea, Tenny? She set the tray on a small table between the couch and her former husband's favourite chair. She kept the table between them in case he lunged at her, then backed away. Tenerife Sniffacre didn't answer. Janet Sniffacre didn't expect him to. Even while alive, he tended to the physical rather than the spiritual, as one might say. It was miracle enough he was there at all, for she had buried him 20 years ago. She couldn't expect him to be chatty as well. He'd spent the time in a wooden box under the ground. Naturally, he didn't have much news. Miracle was one way of putting it anyway. In truth, Mrs. Sniffacre found it a nuisance since he returned 2 nights previously. She had been alone thinking about Professor de Gloob. There had been fireworks that night, then the Allumiere sisters banging on her door. The next thing she knew, her husband, late, was sat in his favourite chair. It could have been worse, of course. His suit was in poor nick, but his body, corpse, had been in surprisingly good condition. Pale and thin, but otherwise not bad physically. No doubt part of his reward for having led such a good life. But now he just sat there. He looked at her when she entered the room or spoke, but that was it. If he had returned to impart some great secret to her, he was in no hurry, yet she couldn't imagine why else he might be there. She poured them 2 cups of tea, one for herself and one for Tenerife. He wouldn't drink it. He didn't want tea. Or anything else. Which was good, in a way. When she recognized his corpse in the parlour, she had been terrified lest a ferocious, jealous fury had driven him to return from the grave. It seemed not. Well, she said, feeling nervous. Not only was he dead, but she had some bad news she needed to break to him as soon as she worked up the courage. Having cheated death, to rise from the grave, to return to his wife's side, Tenerife blinked. He wasn't much work, but he wasn't much fun either. Not that she blamed him for being dead, of course. Lots of people died. Could happen to a bishop. She just didn't know what to do with him. She had loved him once, but then he died on her. Perhaps if she'd known he would one day return, she'd have done things differently. She'd have held off paying a man £2 to fix the fence a few months ago for a start. That job still wasn't properly finished. Once her husband was feeling himself again, no doubt he'd knock it off in no time. First, though, she needed to take him round to visit Reverend Grestart. The church must know what to do when a funeral went wrong. They were always talking about people rising again. Well then. Come on, Tenny, let's get this over with, shall we? She felt a bit mean, but he couldn't just sit in her parlour for the rest of his life. After she'd got over the shock of finding him, she'd bathed him and brushed him off and got him into one of his old suits, which he had held onto for sentimental reasons. The suit's worn black fabric made his white skin look even paler, but he got up when she pulled on his arm, and he followed her when she left. A bit slow, sort of a shamble, really, but he followed her. Eee! On the street, Mrs. Gams stared and pointed. He's dead. You don't say, said Mrs. Sniffacre. Well, well, well. Ah, help! Mrs. Gam's face, normally red from the pie shop's oven, had turned paler even than Tenerife's. Come along, Tenny, said Mrs. Sniffacre, who had always suspected Mrs. Gams of flirting with her husband when he was alive. Woo! Mrs. Gams put a hand to her heart and fluttered her eyes, but nobody was around to catch her if she fainted, so she took another deep breath. Eee! She said, waddling off down the road, toward the church, as luck would have it, and Mrs. Sniffacre followed along behind with her husband trying to hurry and go slowly at the same time. Curtains were twitching and doors opening at the commotion. Help! Cried Mrs. Gams, throwing a panicked look over her shoulder at Mr. Sniffacre as he shambled along beside his wife. We're just off to church, called Mrs. Sniffacre, but there was no use talking to Gams, who could milk any scene for attention. Won't someone save me? Screamed Mrs. Gams. She paused for a moment, possibly to catch her breath, if it wasn't to make sure she didn't escape the zombie before anyone noticed. Back from the dead for my pies. Hoi, said Mr. Oaten, arriving on the scene. He's dead. He pointed at Tenerife Sniffacre, so the two ladies would understand exactly whom he meant. Oh yes, Mr. Oaten, he's back from the grave and he lunged at me, said Mrs. Gams. He did not. He tripped on the path. He doesn't look well at all, said Mr. Oaten, stepping closer. Stop, Tenny, for a moment, said Mrs. Sniffacre. Mr. Oaten was on the town council. Perhaps he could help her, though she doubted it was a municipal matter, really. Oaten got close and stared straight up into Tenerife's eyes. I don't like this, he said. This man's dead. That's why we're going to visit the Reverend, to see what he can do, said Mrs. Sniffacre. The crowd had already gathered, murmuring and glancing worriedly at the resurrected Mr. Sniffacre. Come on, Tenny, let's go. She pulled on his arm, and he started up again. He lunged at me. Mr. Oaten took a step back, tripping over his own feet, just as Tenny had tripped over the loose stone in the pavement. He didn't, said Mrs. Sniffacre. He lunged at me first, said Mrs. Gams. Ooh, he's ever so dead, and yet there he is, looking hungrily at me, as if he just needed one more bite of my... Brains, shouted Miss Milligan. He wants to eat your brains. I dreamt this the other night. All the dead came back, and they wanted to eat my brains. At any other time, Mrs. Sniffacre would have worried about Miss Milligan. She was the local primary school teacher, and a dream like that might suggest latent dissatisfaction with her profession. But this wasn't the time. Brains, shouted the crowd. Brains! Those who wore hats pulled them firmly down over their heads. Come along, Tenny. Mrs. Sniffacre did her best, but if he stumbled again, they'd lynch him. At least he remained calm about the whole thing. Stop right there. Part of the crowd was blocking their way, lurking behind Mr. Thims, who had addressed her. He doesn't want brains, said Mrs. Sniffacre. He's been sitting quietly in his armchair since he came back. Why did he come back, though? Asked Thims. That's what I want to ask the Reverend. Seems to me. Perhaps she was biased, but Mrs. Sniffacre felt the ugliest member of the mob had elected himself spokesperson. Seems to me that if he'd been in heaven, he wouldn't have left it, would he? Mrs. Sniffacre was speechless. That was actually a good point. If Tenny had come back for brains, he could do no worse than start with these ones. So where was he really? Mr. Thims wanted to know. Well, let him speak for himself. He can't. He hasn't said a word since... Where were you, dead man? Up there, or... down below. Ooh, said the crowd. Tenerife Sniffacre looked at Mr. Thims. Then he blinked. In the expectant silence, the tiny noise sounded like a caterpillar swallowing a bit of leaf with its mouth open. Get him, roared Thims. The crowd surged forward, happy to unite behind someone who seemed to know what they were doing. No, they ripped Tenerife out of Mrs. Sniffacre's grasp and carried him off. Probably to burn him unless they intended to placate his ghoulish appetite with one of Mrs. Gamm's pies, should that still be on the menu. I'll take that dead body, said Gertrude Lumiere, who had appeared from behind Mrs. Sniffacre. Gertrude Lumiere and her sisters were new to Hawkinge by Hythe, but they had been there long enough for people to get into the habit of doing what she told them. On the other hand, this was an actual real-life zombie, and they had found it first. If it needs brains, then you'll starve it. Drop it now. Gertrude had arrived in that irritating way she had, confidently and looking like a well-dressed knife. The crowd eyed itself speculatively. The problem with the Lumieres, well, one of the problems was that they were triplets, which was at least two too many. Yet here was Gertrude, all on her own for a change. The crowd eyed itself again to confirm its earlier speculations. I will if you will, said the eyes. Gertrude grinned. My friend Teddy is in a jazz band, said a voice from the other side of the mob, but he's shy and will only play borrowed instruments. The crowd stopped limbering up. He just can't stand to blow his own trumpet, continued the voice. The crowd turned. Coletta Lumiere gave them a friendly nod. Would it be funnier if I made it two jazz musicians called Teddy? The crowd licked its lips and eyed itself desperately. Now or never, it urged. Before Victoria. And this is your husband, is it? Victoria Lumiere asked Mrs. Sniffacre. Yes, they want to. Well, I don't know what, but... Oh, I'm sure they just wanted to help you bring him to see Reverend Gresthart. Isn't that right? The crowd was surrounded. Yes, they said weakly. That's right. Poor man. I said, he doesn't look well, said Mr. Oaten. He did lunge, said Mrs. Grams, but I suppose he didn't mean it. That's right, said Victoria. Shall we go? The mob carried Tenerife to the rectory, then put him down carefully on the porch. Ring the bell for Mrs. Sniffacre, said Gertrude, before it could sidle off. The mob did that too. We'll wait here for you, said Victoria to Mrs. Sniffacre as the door opened. The Lumieres didn't get on with the Reverend, but it was only fair to give him a chance to sort things out before they did. There you go. I hope you enjoyed that. If you'd like to see more excerpts from my books, then leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.